something that he wanted them to do. He had a mission that he wanted them to be a part of, and they were to send some of their contingent on missionary journeys to bring the gospel to places where there was needed workers to go to. And so Paul and Barnabas went out at that time. Interestingly enough, maybe not to the same degree, but those things still happen. About 5.5 years ago, Doug Anderson and I had a chance to go over to China and had the opportunity to support a number of educators and business leaders who were in country in order to help the church there to grow. I would share details with you about what they did, but then I'd have to kill you. So sorry. I won't do that. That's become an ongoing involvement on the part of this church. Doug's taken 12 trips since that time. Marcia was here, Gavin and I relocated to China, and I've been asked to go back a few times last fall, and again I'm going to be going back tomorrow. By the way, there's a graduation. The church has been in existence for, the school for 20 years, and I'm going to have the opportunity to do the graduation commencement address, and I'll get a chance to be able to reconnect. The nice thing is you get to reconnect with leadership, those who are Chinese and non-Chinese. And some of the things I can't say about what we'll be doing, but a great opportunity for us to be able to be touching in a significant way another part of the world. So I'll be gone tomorrow and be back a couple weeks after that. We're talking about passing life's toughest test, and the toughest test is the test of faith. We'll talk a little bit about why it should become obvious as we go along, why the test of faith is so tough. Let's define a couple terms. Faith is confidence in God's faithfulness in the face of conflicting evidence. And that's the thing that makes faith challenging. It's confidence in God's faithfulness, that the things that he promises, that he'll follow through with those things. But this confidence is in the face of conflicting evidence. So there's what you hear from God relative to what he says he'll do. Then you're in situations where you look around and you're saying, I don't see you doing it. And faith is that ability to continue to maintain and sustain faith in the face of conflicting evidence. It's one thing to believe in God when everything's fine. Faith asks us to believe in God when it's not fine. A test of faith, painful circumstances that teach us to base our confidence on what God says rather than what we see. And that's what we'll talk about today, how that happens. But a test of faith is when we're put in circumstances where what God says and what we see point in different directions. He says that he will support us, but then what I see is a lack of support. He says he'll be with us, but what I see is an absence of divine activity. How is our faith tested? God leads us. God leads us out of the water and into the wilderness. He leads us out of the water and into the wilderness. And this is the first thing that makes up a test of faith. It really requires a couple different experiences, water experiences, when God's presence is obvious. And that's where it starts. It's an experience with God. You've had them. Moments where you sensed God doing something and it was undeniable. It might have been a miracle. It might have been circumstances where you were confronted by something. You said, I don't know how in the world I'm going to get out of this. Then you talk to God about it and all of a sudden it resolves itself. And you said, that was a God thing. You've seen those things, God things. Sometimes it's a sense of his presence. I imagine, we think of Memorial Day, there have been times where you have sat alongside loved ones who were at their moment of passing away. And even in the midst of all the grief of that situation, a sense that, gosh, God is here. A sense of God's presence at those times. Water experience. when the presence of God is obvious, and wilderness experiences where God's presence is not obvious. And that's the thing that makes a test of faith so difficult. It's going from one circumstance where God's presence is obvious, clear, his voice ringing like a bell. Then all of a sudden, it's like somebody turned off the lights, and you're in this other circumstance where his presence is not obvious. Then the natural question is, what did I do wrong? What did I do wrong? Nothing. That's how our faith is tested. On the sheet in the worship folder, look on it with me. We find a couple examples of water experiences and wilderness experiences. Look at the Israelites. In Exodus 14 it says, "But the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. When the Israelites saw the great power of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses, his servant." That would have been pretty easy. Walking through the Red Sea, wall of water, right and left. That's a water experience. If we had been there, we would have had the sense, gosh, God is awesome. And they responded that way. They feared the Lord. That's not terrified of him, but they said, boy, God, you're the man. You're the one. And they trusted in Moses, his servant. Look what happens, though. They're not allowed to live on the banks of the miraculous. Right from that place, it goes on, it says, "Then Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went into the desert of Shur. For 3 days they traveled in the desert without finding water." That must have been really abrupt. Walking through water, walls of water, God, you're awesome, then led to a place where there's no water. Water to wilderness. And I think that's the thing that probably makes it feel confusing. See, had there not been the miraculous, the lack of the miraculous would not have seemed so stark. Do you understand what I mean? It's the fact that this happened, and it's great. Now this happens, this isn't great. What happened? I know God can do stuff. Why isn't he doing stuff here? That's a good question. You've asked that question. How about Jesus? Look what it says. He had a water in the wilderness experience. It seems to be a pattern here. Things that those who are trying to be authentic followers of Christ, you're going to go through this stuff. As soon as Jesus was baptized, he went up out of the water. At that moment, heaven was opened, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and lighting on him. And a voice from heaven said, "This is my Son whom I love. With him I am well pleased." Again, the thing about a water experience is that it appeals to the senses. There are things that you can see, feel, walls of water, voices in my ear, tangible expressions of God's presence. It's obvious. But look what happens right afterwards. It says, "Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the desert to be tempted by the devil. After fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry." Same thing, water experience, God really close. Then right from there into a wilderness experience where it seems that God has left, that he's departed. That's what makes a test of faith a test of faith. What sets up the experience, there's two things that seem to conflict with one another. On the one hand, there is what God says. What he said to Jesus, "You are my beloved Son, in you I am well pleased." So he has that ringing in his ear, and then he's in this place where, okay, I hear you saying, "I'm your beloved Son, and you're well pleased with me," but if I'm pleasing to you, where's the water? Why am I in this circumstance where you're not doing anything? I think that's the thing that makes a test of faith a test of faith. And two things clash at that point. There's what I hear from him and what I see around me. This says, "I am with you." This says, "No, you aren't." What do we believe? What he says or what we see? Life's toughest test? I think so. Very difficult. This is what the test is about. You know what's interesting? In the Old Testament, you will never find a heathen being tested. They're not tested. Only children get tested. Only those God owns, has connection with, the righteous get tested. The pagans and the heathens don't. It's interesting. Because the assumption is that if something's going wrong, I must have done something wrong. But as we looked at last week, it says that God disciplines those he loves. We talked about that a little bit. We talked about the difference between discipline and punishment. Let me review that briefly. The motive of discipline is love, and the word literally means to be with a child. And the reason, the thing it shows is God coming alongside one of his children because he loves them. And because of his love, he brings about circumstances that are painful, but the purpose isn't to inflict pain. The focus is on future obedience. And it's God coming alongside saying, this is going to be difficult, and what I'm envisioning is I'm looking to what you will be able to do on the far side of this experience. And punishment is a different thing. The motive of punishment is wrath. And the focus of punishment is on past disobedience. It's when somebody does something wrong and you say, you did this and it's going to hurt me more than I hurt you, and and its focus is on because of what you did wrong. And when we go from water to wilderness, the natural assumption is what? What did I do wrong? Where did I disobey? I hear so many people say when they go through difficult circumstances, oh, I must be doing something wrong. And I've got to figure out what I'm doing wrong so God will call off the goons. So God will call off his henchmen. Okay, God, I got it. You're trying to teach me this. Thanks. Boy, great lesson. Now you can kind of get this nasty circumstance because I understand. Yeah, I really understand this time. But that's not the focus. It's not on just you've done something wrong and that's why you're in the circumstance. He's looking ahead to what you're going to do right. It's a different deal. And he does this because he's a good father. He's a good father. Let me tell you about your father. He is sensitive. He understands your signals and what they say. Sometimes we rage and we say, God, why? And he understands deep underneath that there's fear. And if you're honest with God, God doesn't go, that's it. He doesn't do that because God's sensitive. He sees what gives rise to the expression. He's available. He's within striking distance. He's responsive. And when we call out to him, he hears, but he's cooperative. And what that means, he's not going to reach down and pull you out of every circumstance. Why? Because there's purposes for us being in the wilderness. We learn things there. What do we learn? Our faith is tested. God leads us out of the water and into the wilderness. Secondly, in the wilderness, what God says is challenged by what we see. What did the Israelites base their confidence on? So when they're in this circumstance, what did they base their confidence on and what's the result? Look what it says in Exodus 17. This is just a chapter afterwards where we read before. Again, water, walls of water, right to the wilderness, no water. Now they've been traveling around, and here's what it says. The whole community set out from the desert of Sin, traveling from place to place as the Lord commanded. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. So they quarreled with Moses, and he called the place Massah and Meribah, because the Israelites quarreled, and because they tested the Lord, saying, is the Lord among us or not? Question. What did they base their confidence on? What he said or what they saw? What God said to them, I'm going to lead you and I'll provide for you in the wilderness. That's what he said. They got to this place, what did they see? No water. Did they base their confidence on what God said or what they saw? Which one? What they saw. We're at a place where there's no water. Therefore, we must have been abandoned. Moses, why did you mislead us? Oftentimes when we're in situations, circumstances that feel nasty, it's uncomfortable to assign blame to God, so we end up pointing the finger to somebody else. If our life is not turning out like we want it to turn out, the husband, the wife, the kids, the job, we see things around us that are uncomfortable and we assume that if God's way was being followed, that everything would be fine. Do you find that? I challenge that. What I find biblically is God's children go from the water to the wilderness. And if you do it well and say it right, you are not going to be spared from difficult circumstances. Now you say, oh, thanks, Mike. That's great. But on the other hand, it's hard enough to carry the difficult circumstance. It's harder still to carry the double load of feeling guilty because you're carrying it. You get that? This is one load already, and sometimes you go to people and you say, I'm going through this circumstance, and you want some support. You come out of there having heard, well, if you did it well and said it right, you wouldn't have that circumstance. Here's what that feels like. You go into somebody with one load, and you come out with two. I went in there feeling lousy about the circumstance. Now I have guilt to add to that. I don't think God's going to guilt you for going through difficult things. You go from the water to the wilderness. That's what he says. And there's things that you learn as you do so. What do all these things have in common? Hatred of self or others. Real contempt. Real contempt. Somebody else, you think about them. Ugh. Some of us, our hatred isn't towards others. When we're in circumstances that are difficult, our hatred goes inside. I'm such an idiot. If I wasn't so ... I'd be in a better place. Craving. Again, what do all these have in common? Craving is, I have to have this. I have to have this. We can't get our minds off of it. And we try to get people to give us what we want. We eliminate people who get in the way. Hatred of self and others, craving, demanding others. Not asking, demanding, feeling the right to demand. Unforgiveness, what do all these have in common? They're the results of the byproducts of basing our confidence on what we see. I'll tell you what. We'll talk about this more in the future. We all deal with this. This is not about, well, we all deal with this. We find ourselves getting angry at ourselves and others, demanding, craving. Unforgiveness. We just can't let another person off the hook. If you back up from that, you know what that's about? The sense that if you don't resolve your circumstances, they're never going to be resolved. Why? Because God's not around. God must not be around. Why? Because I have a need. If I have a need, it must be her fault. It must be his fault. And therefore, I've got to get them and I've got to get her. Where's God? I think that's the question. We assume that if things are difficult, God took off. Why do we assume that? Why do we assume that? Do you know the pain that comes from that? The sense of abandonment that comes from that? We'll define two things. Fear is what we feel when we are confronted by a threat. Anxiety is what we feel when we have to face it alone. That's the thing. That's where contempt comes from, I think. We feel alone. We feel abandoned. Of course, this doesn't happen to you. Yet the person on your right or left, you do it well, say it right, so your life is great and you've got everything you want. Be patient. What did Jesus base his confidence on? Look what it said. The tempter came to him and said, if you're the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread. Jesus answered, it looks like, boy, I don't see, what did Jesus say? Boy, it was written. What does he base his confidence on? What he said. What he said. And in so doing, he's in a place where his confidence gets tested, but it doesn't disappear. Why? Because God's promises are bulletproof. And when God promises you as his children that he'll provide for you, he's not lying. Sometimes you'll look at circumstances where it'll seem like he isn't, and the test will be, what are you going to base your confidence on? What you see, think, or feel? Or what he says? Now, Jesus, we aren't Jesus. So, I mean, he was human and divine, so he had an edge. He teaches us, God does, because the Father of Jesus, God the Father, God the Son, He's our Father as well. He teaches us to base our confidence on what He says, and this is where the wilderness come in. How is our faith tested? God leads us out of the water into the wilderness. Secondly, in the wilderness, what God says is challenged by what we see. And then, in the wilderness, God causes us to hunger and then feeds us in unexpected ways to teach us to rely on what He says rather than what we see. Look what it says in Deuteronomy 8. Remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the desert these 40 years. Moses is recalling how they were led around the wilderness. Look at that. Isn't that interesting word? Led. I bet you for them, it seemed like they were walking in, well, they were walking in circles. And they were just traveling around this place to that place, seemingly at the whim of whoever was supposed to be in charge. They blame Moses. But it says God led them. When we walk around in circles, we feel cast adrift. We feel like we don't have an anchor. That I seem to be spinning around in the same rut. I seem to be stuck in the same tracks. We feel like if God were with me, certainly my life would be more directional. God led them all the way in the wilderness. Led them 40 years. It goes on to humble them and to test you, it says, in order to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep His commands. He humbled you, causing you to hunger, and then feeding you with manna, which neither you nor your fathers had known, to teach you that man does not live by bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. Caused to hunger. Caused to hunger. And the hunger they experienced was not the hunger that you're experiencing now. You might be a tad uncomfortable. Early breakfast maybe, looking forward to going out for lunch or cookouts. That hunger was acute. You know what hunger is? Hunger is a God-given alarm system. It signals an irresistible need. And if you disregard this need, you'll die. And that's what hunger is. It's an alarm system. And when your body goes, and you feel that, you feel the stomach growling and stuff like that. Poor attempt at stomach growling noise, just didn't come out. Hunger is an alarm system, signals an irresistible need. When you're hungry, you're aware of need. And the awareness is this: I have what I don't want. I have what I don't want. I don't have what I do want. You know what that's called? Need. Need. Hunger, another word for it perhaps. Not just physical. What that's about, when you have what you don't want, or you don't have what you do want. God leads us to places where that happens. And there is an inability to do anything about it, and that's what makes it painful. Talk about hunger pains. You might find yourself in one of 4 boxes. You have what you want. Ooh, that's kind of cool. Okay. You have what you want. I don't have what I want. I don't have what I don't want. I have what I don't want. You're saying, Mike, that's confusing. Let's talk about it. When you have what you want and you don't have what you don't want, hunger's pretty light. Everything's green. Your hunger alarm, your system is not shouting. And if you're in a situation right now where basically you have what you want, you don't have what you don't want. If I say to you, not physically, are you hungry? You'll say, I'm doing okay. I'm set. I can hold on a little bit. How about when you have what you want, but you also have what you don't want? That happens. In a relationship, there are some good things in a relationship. You have what you want. But then there's those irritating mannerisms. Never puts the toilet seat down. And there's other more severe things than that. That's yellow. It's becoming caution. And when we're in this place, we have what we want, but we have what we don't want as well. That doesn't feel as comfortable. We start to become aware of need. Gosh, I'd like to get rid of that. I would like to cause him to stop doing that. I would like to get her to quit saying that. Churns. How can I do that? What can I say? Same thing with, I don't have what I want, but I don't have what I don't want, so I don't have a bunch of bad things, but I don't have all the good things that I want. Yeah, things are okay. Boy, I wish I had a better job. I wish I had a better social life. You know, not that things are bad. I'm kind of cruising along. It's just something's missing. And that could be a yellow alert, but you know what's coming. Quadrant 4. I don't have what I want. And I have what I don't want. I think we call that the wilderness, and that the wilderness, and that's really the wilderness. What happens in the wilderness? We get here, here, or here, and we try to fix it. We try to get what I want, get rid of what I don't want. We try to do all those things, unable to do so. We can't rectify it. And you know what ends up happening? What ends up happening when you try to fix things that don't get fixed? What happens? You start to get hateful toward yourself. You start to show contempt for yourself. Or you show contempt for others. It's her fault. It's his fault. That's why I don't have what I want. I don't have the right wife. I don't have the right husband. Don't have the right kids. Don't have the right job. And here's what's interesting. In this place, God feeds us in unexpected ways. There's a situation that comes about and we said, I never would have guessed that anything like that could happen. And it was at the end of our rope, and all of a sudden I'm on solid ground. And that's how God teaches us to rely on what he says rather than what we see. I told you this story before, a missionary who was sick, and she was running out of food. The cupboard was bare, and the people supposed to send her the check that she cashes to live on, they didn't do so. The check was late, and imagine. So she's not asking for a lot, she's serving God. But she feels sick, and she has no money to buy food. Here's what she has: oatmeal. 30 days she had to live on oatmeal until she was able to get the money. She was sharing this in a missions conference when she was back in the States, was describing this event, and when they were talking about some of the tests of being on the field, describing this, and a doctor came up to her afterwards. He said, tell me about your condition. And she described, well, I felt this way, and this has happened, and that happened, I looked this way. He said, if that check had come when it was supposed to have come, you wouldn't be here now. That disease is called blank, and what we prescribe for that disease is a 30-day oatmeal diet. See, the deal about a test is that you don't know it's a test when you're in it. All you know is that I have what I don't want, and I don't have what I do want, and not only am I afraid, here's the kicker, I feel abandoned. I feel abandoned. This makes it tough. 2 needs. When we deal with something, there is fear. It's what we feel when we face a threat. You're going to feel afraid. Because guess what? God's will is not done perfectly on this planet. There's scary things that happen here. And if you don't see them, you're not looking. And if you think, well, I'm never going to be afraid, that's ridiculous. Of course you're going to feel fear. You feel it when you perceive a threat. That's what fear is. Fear is what we feel when there's a perceived threat. You say, by Mike, it says, don't fear not. I think that there's a couple senses to fear. This is the one. Anxiety is what we feel when we have to face this threat alone. It seems where God targets the anxiety thing. You're going to face things that are going to feel uncomfortable if you're a child of God. That's just the deal. What's going to happen underneath? There'll be a sense of fear. And if you look deeper, but you have to look deeper. And what you have to stop doing, you have to stop blaming. You won't find it if you keep on blaming. You won't find the solution to your problem. You have to stop blaming. You have to stop heaping contempt on yourself or others. Try to look past the forgiveness issue, and if you look deeper within what you'll find, difficult feelings. Why did you abandon me? And what God says, I didn't. I didn't abandon you. What do you do? JC is going to talk about preparing for the test next week. I'd like to point your address. Look in the back, 4x4. What do you do? I think you need promises. What we need, I'd say, as much more so than different circumstances, is a different focus. Anxiety is what we feel when we have to face the situation alone. I think these promises speak to those things. What I would encourage you, when you're in the wilderness, shift it into 4x4. You know what a 4x4 is? Four-wheel drive. When you're going through bumpy terrain, you shift it into 4x4, and it helps you navigate terrain that's difficult. Two sets of 4 promises. I would encourage you to lean into what Jesus knows. Everything is uncovered and laid bare before the eyes of him to whom you must give account. Sometimes we pretend, and we say, oh, I'm not discouraged. Yes, we get discouraged. Stop pretending. Lean into what he knows. Jesus, I'm so glad that you know what's in me, so I don't have to pretend. I sure would like to be better. I would like to be reacting better, but I'm not. And I thank you that I'm not pulling the wool over your eyes, and I can come to you as I am. There's what he knows, there's who he is. He's a faithful high priest. It talks about high priests. It says, Hebrews 5:2, every high priest is able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and are going astray, since he himself is subject to weakness. High priests are really good at dealing gently with sinners. So if you're a sinner and you have difficult attitudes, you might even deal with contempt. Then he's the guy you need to go to. He's the go-to guy because he knows what you're dealing with. And he also is able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and are going astray. And there's how he feels. He sympathizes with your weaknesses. That doesn't mean he's done what you've done, but he understands it. He understands that everything in this world pulls us to base our confidence on what we see rather than what he says. He fought that off, and he understands that we don't sometimes. And what he wants you to come to the throne of grace. What would happen if you leaned into those? Difficult circumstance? God, I thank you for what you know and who you are and how you feel and what you want. That focus will have you leaning into what he says, and you'll find that will dissipate. That will dissipate. It won't be gone, but it will lessen. Thinking about promises, leaning into them will give you the sense, I have this thing in my life that I don't like, but I'm not alone. And those are the 2 things you got to hold on to. Those are the 2 things. I have this circumstance, you got to hold on. Things aren't great in your life. You know, there's things, always challenges, but I'm not alone. Hang on both of those things together. Then there are God in me. He says he'll put his law in your mind and write it on your heart. Are you going to be okay? He says you're going to be okay. That he will help you to be the person he wants you to be. He will work on you inside. He's not only in you, he's with you. He will cause you to know him. And that's part of the reason why wilderness experiences come. Good's ahead of you. Look what it says. I love this verse. They will be my people and I will be their God. I will give them singleness of heart and action so that they will always fear me for their own good and the good of their children after them. I will make an everlasting covenant with them. I will never stop doing good to them, and I will inspire them to fear me so that they will never turn away from me. I will rejoice in doing them good. When God's in you and God's with you, good's ahead of you. And it's guaranteed. It says, for I will forgive their wickedness and will remember their sin no more. Okay, what will happen if you... Whoa. See, wilderness. I'm just walking around fine. All of a sudden, bam! And, okay, so I'm thinking about leaning into the promises. There'll still be scary things. But if you think about what he knows and who he is and how he feels and what he wants, I guarantee you will begin to sense that you're not alone. And that will start to relieve the anxiety that deep within that you feel because you feel abandoned. If you think about the fact that God's in you and God's with you and God's ahead of you, guaranteed, he can't lie, I guarantee your anxiety will dissipate. Now the deal is you're going to have to do this tomorrow. Because manna comes a day at a time. He's not going to give you a bunch to store up. You're going to deal with issues tomorrow. Go back to it tomorrow. The promises will be there then. See, that's the good deal about basing your confidence on what he says. You come back to these promises tomorrow, even though your circumstances look different, these promises are the same. He still knows. He's still a high priest. He still sympathizes. He still wants you to come to the throne of grace. He's still in you. He's still with you. Good's still ahead of you, guaranteed. Come back next year. Come back 2 years. They'll be the same. You lean into them, you'll find a growing capacity to believe them. And it will help you pass the test. Or move through it. Move through the test. What box are you in? Some of you would say, things are okay. Some of you are in one of the yellow boxes. Some of you are in the red box. What do you do? You could keep complaining. We do that. You could keep blaming. You could base your confidence on what you see. You could hold on to that if they had done this and hold on to the anger and the rage. You could do that. Why? Or you could refocus on what he knows and who he is and how he feels and what he wants. And you could refocus on God in you, God with you, God ahead of you, guaranteed. And if you did that, you would feel less alone. We have to get in these circumstances because it seems there was a song we ended with last week. We're going to end with it again, same song. In situations where he's all you have, it's in those circumstances that you discover that he is all you need. Let's listen to that, David, cue it up, and then just listen to the words, listen to the music, look at it, and then we'll close. Closing prayer. Father, I want to thank you for being sensitive and available and responsive and cooperative, for being a good father. I pray that you'd help us when we go from the water to the wilderness, when we're tempted to believe that we've been abandoned, forsaken, fearful things, but the sense that we face those fearful things alone. Would you help us to have the kind of resolve that Jesus had? Again, we're not Jesus, but we can learn that stuff. In the middle of our wilderness, would you help us to refocus a little bit more anyways on what you say to us, to base our confidence on your promises. I don't think it means our circumstances will all of a sudden shift. They might not, but it means that we don't feel so alone in them. And I think that's everything. Faith is confidence in the face of conflicting evidence, and your promises will lead us to believe that our confidence is founded. Your promises are true. I pray that you'd help us to be more authentic followers of yours. In Jesus' name, amen. Hey, on the way out, have a great Memorial Day, by the way. Cookouts, whatever you're going to do. There are some Da Vinci Code magazines. If you've got some friends that have seen the movie that are really wrestling, take a couple. It's a good little